The scorching Montana sun beat down mercilessly as Harriet Lowell sat alone in the garden of her family's homestead, tears streaming down her face, her wedding dress billowing around her like a defeated flag of surrender. Her groom had never arrived. The year was 1878, and at 22 years of age, Harriet had just become the talk of Helena, the bride abandoned at the altar by Thomas Reed, a banker's son who had apparently fled town with his family's savings and a saloon girl from the Gilt Edge. 50 guests had witnessed her humiliation before slowly dispersing, leaving behind whispers that would echo through the territory for months to come. "Miss Lowell." A deep voice startled her from her misery. Harriet hastily wiped her tears, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. Looking up, she saw a tall figure silhouetted against the sun. As he stepped closer, she recognized Elijah Lawson, one of the hands from the neighboring Rocking L Ranch. She had seen him in town occasionally but knew little of him beyond his reputation as a skilled horseman and reliable worker. "Mr. Lawson," she acknowledged, her voice barely steady. "If you've come for the celebration, I'm afraid there's nothing to celebrate." Elijah removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "I heard what happened in town. I'm sorry, Miss Lowell." Harriet looked away, unable to bear another pitying glance. "You needn't be. It seems I'm better off knowing now rather than later what kind of man Thomas Reed truly is." Elijah shifted uncomfortably, then seemed to make a decision. He knelt down and reached toward a wild rosebush that grew along the garden fence. With careful movements to avoid the thorns, he plucked a perfect pink bloom. "My mother always said that a garden without roses is like a heart without love incomplete," he said softly, offering her the flower. "Maybe this one can be the start of something new." Harriet accepted the rose, surprised by the simple gesture that somehow meant more than all the hollow condolences she'd received that day. "That's kind of you, Mr. Lawson." "Elijah, please," he said, standing back up and replacing his hat. "And if you don't mind my saying so, Miss Lowell, any man who'd leave you waiting deserves to be run out of the territory." Despite everything, Harriet found herself smiling. "Harriet," she corrected, "and thank you for the rose and the sentiment." Elijah nodded, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment. "Would you care for some company, Harriet, or would you prefer to be alone?" The question was asked with such genuine concern that Harriet found herself patting the bench beside her. Company would be welcome, actually. "I've had quite enough of my own thoughts for one day." Elijah sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "I reckon thoughts can be dangerous companions sometimes." "Indeed they can," Harriet agreed, twirling the rose between her fingers. "How is it that you came to be passing by our homestead today?" Elijah looked somewhat sheepish. "Well, truth be told, I wasn't just passing by. I heard about what happened at the church, and He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've always thought you deserved better than Thomas Reed. I came to see if you were all right." Harriet studied him with new interest. "Have we spoken before today, Elijah? More than a passing greeting in town, I mean." "No, madam, we haven't," he admitted. "But I've noticed you at church socials, in town at Donovan's General Store. You're always kind to everyone, even old Mrs. Patterson who complains about everything under the sun." Harriet laughed softly. "Mrs. Patterson has earned the right to complain. She crossed half the country in a wagon train and buried 3 husbands along the way." They fell into an easy conversation as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. Harriet learned that Elijah had come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, that he could read and write better than most cowmen, and that he had saved enough to buy a small parcel of land but was waiting for the right time. He listened attentively as she spoke of her family's journey from Boston after the war, her father's dreams for their ranch, and her own passion for teaching the children at the local school. When Harriet's father eventually came looking for her, concern etched on his weathered face, he found his daughter laughing at something Elijah had said, the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her in hours. "Mr. Lawson," her father greeted with a nod. I see you've been keeping my daughter company. Yes, sir, Mr. Lowell, Elijah stood respectfully. I hope you don't mind my intrusion on such a day. Any man who can bring a smile back to my daughter's face is welcome here, Mr. Lowell said, though his eyes held a cautious assessment. Will you stay for supper? My wife has prepared enough for a wedding feast that won't be happening. Elijah glanced at Harriet, who nodded almost imperceptibly. I'd be honored, sir, thank you. That evening marked the beginning of something neither Harriet nor Elijah could have anticipated. What started as comfort offered on a day of heartbreak slowly evolved over the weeks that followed. Elijah began finding reasons to ride by the Lowell homestead, offering help with a difficult horse, bringing news from town, or sometimes simply stopping to share coffee and conversation. Harriet found herself looking forward to his visits, her disappointment palpable on days when he didn't appear. As summer turned to autumn, Harriet's teaching duties resumed at the schoolhouse. One afternoon, as she was dismissing her students, she looked up to find Elijah leaning against his horse outside the schoolyard gate. Mr. Lawson, she greeted him with a smile, conscious of the curious glances from her departing pupils. This is an unexpected pleasure. Miss Lowell, he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I was hoping I might escort you home today. The trail's been showing signs of mountain lion activity. Harriet knew perfectly well that she had been walking the same trail safely for years, but she nodded seriously. How fortunate that you happened by, then. As they walked, leading Elijah's horse behind them, Harriet found herself stealing glances at his profile. In the months since her failed wedding, she had come to appreciate his steady presence, his quiet strength, and the way he listened to her as though her thoughts mattered. There's a harvest dance in town next Saturday, Elijah said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. I was wondering if you might consider attending with me. Harriet's steps faltered. This would be different from his casual visits to the homestead or chance meetings in town. This would be a public declaration of sorts. People will talk, she said softly. It hasn't been that long since. Let them talk, Elijah replied, his voice gentle but firm. You've done nothing wrong, Harriet, and I'd be proud to walk into that dance with you on my arm. Looking up at him, Harriet saw no pity in his eyes, only admiration and something warmer that made her heart beat faster. Yes, she said finally. I would like that very much, Elijah. The harvest dance transformed everything. Harriet wore a simple blue dress rather than anything that might remind people of her wedding day. When Elijah saw her, the look on his face made her feel more beautiful than any elaborate gown ever had. There were whispers, of course, as they danced together. But Elijah kept her close, his hand steady at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. By the end of the evening, the whispers had changed from scandal to speculation about a new courtship. As winter settled over the territory, Elijah became a regular visitor at the Lowell dinner table. Harriet's father, initially reserved, had warmed to the young cowboy after discovering his knowledge of cattle breeding and his plans for his own ranch someday. Her mother appreciated his unfailing politeness, and the way he always brought something for the household: coffee, sugar, or occasionally a book for Harriet. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside, Elijah presented Harriet with a small wooden box after dinner. I carved it myself, he explained as she ran her fingers over the intricate rose pattern on the lid. Open it. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When Harriet looked at him questioningly, he explained, It was my mother's. My father gave it to her when they were courting. I've been saving it for the right person. Harriet's eyes filled with tears as she realized what he was saying. Elijah, I'm not asking anything of you tonight, he assured her quickly. I know it's too soon. I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you ever are, I'll be waiting. Harriet closed the box carefully and reached for his hand. Thank you for understanding, and for this beautiful gift. What neither of them could have predicted was the harsh winter that followed. January brought blizzards that isolated homesteads and threatened livestock throughout the territory. The Lowell ranch suffered badly, losing cattle to the freezing temperatures and dwindling feed supplies. Elijah rode through dangerous conditions to help Mr. Lowell shore up fences and move the remaining cattle to more sheltered areas. During one such journey, they were caught in a sudden squall that separated them. Mr. Lowell made it back to the homestead, but Elijah did not. For 3 terrifying days, Harriet and her family feared the worst. Search parties went out when the weather cleared slightly but returned empty-handed. Harriet barely slept, her mind filled with images of Elijah lost in the snow, freezing to death while she was safe by the fire. On the 4th day, as hope was fading, a rider approached the homestead. Harriet ran out into the snow, her heart pounding, to find Elijah slumped in the saddle, his face frostbitten but very much alive. "You came back," she whispered as they helped him inside. "I promised I'd wait for you," he mumbled through cracked lips. "Can't do that if I don't come back." As Elijah recovered from his ordeal, something shifted in Harriet's heart. The thought of losing him had clarified her feelings in a way that months of quiet courtship had not. She no longer saw him as the kind man who had comforted her on her worst day, but as the man she couldn't imagine living without. Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it brought renewal to both the land and Harriet's spirit. On a mild April evening, she found Elijah in the garden where they had first truly spoken, kneeling beside the rosebush that had provided that first bloom he'd given her. "What are you doing?" she asked, approaching him with curiosity. He looked up with a smile. "Planting." "Your father said I could add some things to the garden." He gestured to several small bushes waiting to be placed in the ground. "More roses, different colors. I thought you might like them." Harriet knelt beside him, not caring about the dirt that would soil her skirt. "You're planting roses for me." "I'm planting roots," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "If you'll have me, Harriet, I'd like to plant more than roses here. I'd like to build a life, with you." Harriet's heart swelled as she understood what he was asking. "Are you proposing to me, Elijah Lawson?" He nodded, suddenly looking nervous. "I am. I love you, Harriet. I think I've loved you since that day I found you here, stronger in your sorrow than most people are in their joy." Harriet reached out to touch his face, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. "And I love you. Not because you were kind when I needed kindness, but because of who you are every day since." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice hopeful. "It's a yes," she confirmed, laughing as he pulled her into his arms, unmindful of the dirt on both their hands. Unlike her previous engagement, Harriet and Elijah's wedding plans were modest and unhurried. They set a date in September, giving them time to prepare, and Elijah time to complete work on the small cabin he was building on his land, adjacent to the Lowell property. Summer brought its own challenges when word reached Helena that Thomas Reed had been captured in Denver and would be brought back to stand trial for the money he had stolen. The news reopened wounds Harriet had thought long healed. "You want to postpone the wedding?" Elijah asked her one evening as they sat on the porch, the topic hanging heavy between them. Harriet considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "What Thomas did is part of my past. You are my future, Elijah. I won't let him take anything more from me." When Thomas was brought back in chains, Harriet did not go to see him. Instead, she focused on preparing for her life with Elijah, teaching her students and helping her mother with preserving the summer harvest for winter. In late August, just weeks before their wedding, disaster struck the territory again when a fire broke out in Helena's business district. Every able-bodied man, including Elijah and Mr. Lowell, joined the bucket brigades trying to save the town. Harriet watched in horror from a distance as the flames leapt from building to building. When she learned that men were trapped in the collapsing mercantile, her blood ran cold. Hours later, ash-covered and exhausted, Elijah returned to tell her that her father was safe but injured, with burns on his hands and a broken arm from falling debris. "And you?" she asked, examining him for injuries. "I'm fine," he assured her, though his voice was hoarse from smoke. "But Harriet, there's something else. Thomas Reed escaped during the chaos." Harriet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Escaped, but surely they'll recapture him. They're searching, but in the confusion, Elijah hesitated. Sheriff thinks he might try to leave the territory. I wanted you to know so you could be careful. For days afterward, Harriet jumped at shadows, fearful that Thomas might seek revenge for his capture and imprisonment. Elijah stayed at the Lowell homestead, sleeping in the barn to ensure her family's safety. A week passed with no sign of Thomas. The town began rebuilding, and Mr. Lowell's injuries slowly improved. Harriet and Elijah resumed their wedding preparations, though Elijah insisted on accompanying her whenever she left the homestead. Then, 3 days before the wedding, Harriet was alone in the garden cutting late-blooming roses for her bridal bouquet when a familiar voice froze her blood. "You replaced me quickly enough, Harriet." She turned slowly to find Thomas Reed standing at the garden gate, thinner and harder than she remembered, his once fine clothes now ragged and dirty. "Thomas," she acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt, "you shouldn't be here." The sheriff won't find me," he interrupted. "I'll be long gone. But I couldn't leave without seeing you one last time, without explaining." "You need explain nothing to me," Harriet said firmly. "Your actions spoke clearly enough." Thomas took a step closer, his eyes darting nervously. "I made a mistake, Harriet. I panicked. The bank was failing, my father's investments were worthless. I thought I could double the money and return before anyone knew it was gone." "And the saloon girl. Was she part of your investment strategy?" Harriet couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Thomas at least had the grace to look ashamed. "Maggie was a mistake too. She left me in Denver with what little money I had left." He reached out suddenly, grabbing Harriet's arm. "Come with me, Harriet. We can start over somewhere new." "Let go of me, Thomas," Harriet said coldly. "I'm marrying Elijah in 3 days. That ranch hand," Thomas scoffed, his grip tightening. "What can he offer you compared to what we could have together?" "Everything that matters," came Elijah's voice from behind them. He stood at the garden entrance, his stance relaxed but his eyes hard. "Let her go, Reed." Thomas pulled Harriet against him roughly. "Stay back, Lawson. Harriet and I have unfinished business." "The only unfinished business here is between you and the law," Elijah replied evenly, taking a step forward. "You're hurting her." Thomas backed away, dragging Harriet with him. "I'll hurt her more if you come any closer. I'm taking her with me." "No, you're not," Harriet said, bringing her heel down hard on Thomas's foot. As he yelped in pain, she twisted free and moved swiftly toward Elijah. Thomas recovered quickly, lunging after her with rage in his eyes. Elijah met him halfway, his fist connecting with Thomas's jaw in a solid punch that sent the banker's son sprawling. "Stay down if you know what's good for you," Elijah warned, positioning himself between Thomas and Harriet. Instead, Thomas scrambled to his feet and charged like a wounded bull. The men collided in a flurry of fists, tumbling into the carefully tended garden beds. Harriet watched in horror as they struggled, then ran toward the house to get help. When she returned with the ranch hand who had been working in the barn, they found Elijah sitting on Thomas's chest, pinning the man's arms with his knees. "Tie him up," Elijah directed the ranch hand, his breathing heavy. "We're taking him to the sheriff." Thomas Reed was returned to jail, this time with additional charges and guards who wouldn't be distracted by a fire. The incident cast a shadow over the wedding preparations, but Harriet refused to let it derail their plans. "He can't touch us anymore," she told Elijah as they walked arm in arm the evening before their wedding. "Tomorrow I'll be Harriet Lawson, and Thomas Reed will be nothing more than a memory." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. Unlike her previous wedding, this one was held not in the church, but in the Lowell garden, with the roses Elijah had planted in full bloom around them. Harriet wore a simple cream dress adorned with lace her mother had saved for years, and carried a bouquet of the mixed roses that now flourished where once there had been only the single wild rosebush. As she walked toward Elijah, her father proudly at her side despite his bandaged arm, Harriet felt none of the nervousness that had plagued her before her first wedding day. There was only certainty, joy, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "You look beautiful," Elijah whispered when she reached him. "And you look like the answer to a prayer I didn't know I was making," she whispered back. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, promising love, respect, and partnership through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering of friends and family erupted in cheers that seemed to echo across the Montana landscape. The celebration that followed was joyful but modest, with food and music and dancing that lasted until sunset. As twilight fell, Elijah led his bride away from the gathering and back to the spot in the garden where he had found her that fateful day. "Do you remember what I told you when I gave you that first rose?" he asked, taking her hands in his. Harriet smiled up at him, her heart full. "That a garden without roses is like a heart without love, incomplete." "I was a lonely man before I met you, Harriet," Elijah said softly. "My heart was an empty garden. You filled it with more beauty than I ever thought possible. And you showed me that what I thought was the end was really just the beginning," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "I thank God every day that you walked into this garden when you did." Elijah bent to kiss her, a kiss full of promise for the future they would build together. As they broke apart, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another perfect rose. "The first of many I'll give you over our lifetime together," he promised, tucking it into her hair. "I'll hold you to that, Elijah Lawson," Harriet said with a smile that outshone the emerging stars. In the years that followed, Elijah kept his promise. Their small cabin expanded as their family grew, and the rose garden he planted became famous throughout the territory. Even in the harshest Montana winters, Elijah would somehow find a way to present Harriet with a bloom, sometimes traveling for days to bring one back from Helena or even as far as Bozeman. They faced the challenges that came with life in the West drought years that threatened their cattle, the economic panic of 1893 that nearly cost them their ranch, the influenza that swept through the territory in the winter of 1889, claiming friends and neighbors. Through it all, they stood together, their love deepening with each obstacle overcome. By 1898, 20 years after that first meeting in the garden, Elijah and Harriet had built a thriving ranch, raised 3 children who were strong and kind, and established a legacy of love that inspired everyone who knew them. On their 20th anniversary, Elijah took Harriet back to the garden where it all began. Though they were both older now, the love in their eyes when they looked at each other was unchanged. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas had shown up that day? Elijah asked as they sat on the same bench where they had first truly talked. Harriet shook her head. "No, I believe some things are meant to be, Elijah. If not that day, we would have found each other another way." "I'd have found you," he agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "Across any distance, through any obstacle, my heart would have found its way to yours." "And mine to yours," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder as the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, a fitting backdrop for a love story that had bloomed from the simple gift of a single flower on a day of heartbreak, growing into a garden of memories that would sustain them for all their days.